When Jennifer Hudson stood on stage, holding award after award for her role in Dreamgirls, she paused. Then she said something that caught many people off guard. She dedicated her moment to a woman who never truly had won. That single sentence reopened a chapter of American music history that had been quietly closed. One filled with harmony, heartbreak, and a voice that once helped change the sound of a nation, only to be left behind when the spotlight moved on. In the 1960s, America was listening. Black music crossed racial lines. Motown became the sound of young America. And one group, in particular, seemed unstoppable, breaking records, appearing on national television, and uniting audiences in a country still deeply divided. But behind that polished image was a story rarely told in full. A story about talent that didn't fit the machine. About a voice too raw, too soulful, too honest for the direction success demanded. About what happens when an artist helps build something historic, but loses control of her own place within it. This is not a story about fame. It's a story about cost. This is the story of Florence Ballard, a founding voice of the Supremes, and one of the most overlooked figures in American soul music. And before the hits, before the gowns, before the headlines, her story began in a place far removed from applause. Detroit did not offer Florence Ballard an easy beginning. It offered noise, movement, and survival. Born on June 30th, 1943, Florence Ballard came into a family so large it felt more like a small community. She was one of 15 children. Space was limited, money even more so. Her parents worked when they could, but stability came and went. The family moved often, chasing rent they could afford, until they finally settled in the Brewster Projects, one of Detroit's most crowded housing developments. But inside that chaos, there was music. From the time she could speak, Florence sang. At home, in church, with siblings, cousins, anyone who would listen. Singing wasn't encouraged, it was assumed. It was how feelings moved through the room when words were too small. By the age of 5, her voice already carried weight. Not volume alone, but feeling. A tone that sounded older than her years. People noticed. Her nickname, Flo, came easily. Blondie followed, because of her lighter complexion and auburn hair. But what stayed with her was not how she looked. It was how she sounded. Even as a child, her voice had a church-trained power, strong, rooted, emotional. When she sang, people stopped talking. At Brewster Projects, Florence met Mary Wilson. The two girls shared more than a neighborhood. They shared ambition. They entered the same talent shows, stood on the same makeshift stages, and watched each other closely. Mary later recalled that Florence's voice was so powerful she had to step back from the microphone. Teachers suggested opera, not as a compliment, but as a serious path. But opera wasn't realistic. Survival was. Florence and Mary made a promise to each other. If one of them ever got a real opportunity, an audition, a contract, a door cracked open, they would bring the other along. In an industry that rarely protected young black girls, that promise became a form of safety. As teenagers, Florence and her sister Maxine crossed paths with a local performer named Milton Jenkins. He led a male vocal group called the Primettes, Paul Williams and Eddie Kendricks among them, long before the Temptations became legends. Jenkins was looking for female singers to create a sister group. Girl groups were beginning to dominate the radio. When Florence sang, Jenkins didn't hesitate. He asked a simple question: did she know anyone else? She brought Mary Wilson. She brought Betty McGlown. Later, Diana Ross joined the group. They called themselves the Primettes. Rehearsals were relentless. Every day after school, harmonies tightened. Confidence grew. They performed wherever someone would listen: cabarets, dances, small venues, singing covers like Ray Charles's "Nighttime is the Right Time." They were paid little, sometimes almost nothing, but they were learning how to work a crowd. What they wanted most was to be heard on the radio. Motown was the dream. Berry Gordy had only just started the label, but his reputation was already spreading across Detroit. Artists like Smokey Robinson, Marvin Gaye, and Mary Wells were finding their way into national attention. The girls wanted in. An audition came, but not the deal. Gordy said they were too young. Finish school, he told them. Come back later. That rejection didn't end the dream. It delayed it. A Motown songwriter and engineer named Richard Morris saw something in them and took them under his wing. He helped them refine their sound and secured a small deal with Lupin Records. The Primettes recorded singles and sang background vocals for other artists. Even then, Florence's voice stood out. On recordings where others sang lead, her background vocals still commanded attention. But something happened that changed her forever. One night, after attending a sock hop at Detroit's Greystone Ballroom, Florence couldn't find her brother to walk her home. A neighborhood acquaintance offered her a ride. She accepted. He raped her at knife point. The trauma did not fade. Florence withdrew. She stopped singing. She stayed inside for months. No counseling. No support system. Just silence. When she eventually returned to the group, encouraged by Mary and Diana, those closest to her noticed the difference. She was present, but altered. Strong on stage. Fragile off it. The industry didn't pause for healing. Florence dropped out of high school. Others graduated. At Hitsville, USA, Motown's headquarters, the girls showed up every day after school, hoping to be useful. Hand claps, background vocals, whatever was needed. They were paid $78 a week. Florence babysat on the side. Mary worked at a record store. Diana was given a job as Berry Gordy's secretary, placing her close to power. That proximity would matter later. When Motown finally offered a contract, it came with strings. Complete control. Low pay. Long hours. The girls were minors. Their parents signed with hesitation, but hope outweighed fear. Berry Gordy changed the group's name. The Primettes sounded dated. Florence suggested something new. The Supremes. Diana didn't like it at first. It sounded masculine. But the name stuck. For Florence Ballard, the foundation had been laid in poverty, talent, trauma, and resilience. Her voice had carried her this far, not because it was safe, but because it was real. What came next would bring history and heartbreak. By the time the name The Supremes appeared on paper, the work had already been done the hard way. Long before contracts, chart positions, or television appearances, Florence Ballard and the girls were known simply as the Primettes. Teenagers chasing microphones across Detroit for pennies and possibility. They rehearsed every day, not because someone told them to, but because discipline was the only thing they truly owned. Motown was still young then. Hitsville, USA felt less like a corporation and more like a crowded workshop where talent waited its turn. Berry Gordy had vision, but he also had rules. When the Primettes first auditioned, he didn't reject them outright. He postponed them. Too young, he said. Finish school first. That answer changed nothing. They kept showing up. A Motown engineer and songwriter named Richard Morris believed in them enough to step in. He helped them shape their sound and secured a small deal with Lupin Records. The label wasn't prestigious, but it was a start. They recorded singles like Tears of Sorrow and Pretty Baby. Diana Ross and Mary Wilson sang lead on those records, but Florence's background vocals still cut through. Even when she wasn't centered, she was impossible to ignore. Behind the scenes, life was far from glamorous. After school, the girls went straight to Hitsville, hoping to be useful. Hand claps, background vocals, anything Berry Gordy needed that day. They were paid $78 a week. Florence babysat on the side to make ends meet. Mary worked at a record store. Diana Ross, through her connection to Smokey Robinson, was given a job as Berry Gordy's secretary, placing her close to the heart of Motown's decision-making. That proximity quietly shifted the balance of power. Then came the moment that altered Florence Ballard's inner world forever. One night, after a sock hop at Detroit's Greystone Ballroom, Florence couldn't find her brother to walk her home. A young man she knew from the neighborhood offered her a ride. She trusted him. He raped her at knife point. There were no press reports, no public outrage, no counseling. Florence withdrew from the world. She stopped singing. She stayed inside for months. When she eventually returned, encouraged by Mary Wilson and Diana Ross, those closest to her noticed the difference. The voice was still there. The confidence was not. According to Mary, Florence was never the same after that night. The industry did not pause for healing. Florence dropped out of high school. Her family was disappointed, but they didn't fully understand the damage she was carrying. Motown moved forward. Contracts were prepared. Control was centralized. Lawyers, managers, accountants, everything was in-house. The girls were minors. Their parents signed with hesitation, trusting Berry Gordy's promise of opportunity. The contract was harsh. Even if the group sold 1 million records, each member would receive only a few $1,000s. But at that moment, ownership felt abstract. Being heard felt urgent. The Primettes needed a new name. Berry Gordy thought the old one sounded dated. Florence suggested the Supremes. Diana Ross didn't like it at first. It sounded masculine. But the name stuck. And once it did, there was no turning back. The early years under Motown were frustrating. Single after single failed to chart. People began calling them the no-hit Supremes. Confidence wavered. Florence, already struggling emotionally, felt the pressure deeply. At one point, she stepped away briefly and joined another Motown group, the Marvelettes, replacing Wanda Young while she was on maternity leave. The Marvelettes were already successful, Motown's first group to hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. That experience changed things. When Florence returned to the Supremes, Berry Gordy shifted his approach. He paired them with Motown's most powerful songwriting and production team, Holland-Dozier-Holland. The Funk Brothers were on deck. Everything tightened. The sound sharpened. The stakes rose. One song would change everything. Where Did Our Love Go wasn't embraced at first. It felt strange. Even Diana Ross reportedly sang it in a way she thought would be rejected. But Berry Gordy insisted. He believed Diana's voice had crossover appeal, something that could reach white audiences without resistance. The song went to #1. Almost overnight, the no-hit Supremes became America's sweethearts. As the country grieved President Kennedy's assassination and faced the heat of the civil rights movement, the music offered something people needed: joy, harmony, and a sense of possibility. Black and white audiences screamed together. The Supremes and the Temptations stood at the center of a cultural shift. Hit after hit followed. 5 consecutive #1 singles. National television. International tours. The group was unstoppable. But inside that success, something was already cracking. As Berry Gordy focused more attention on Diana Ross, both professionally and personally, the balance within the group shifted. The name changed again. Diana Ross and the Supremes. Florence Ballard understood what that meant. Her voice was powerful, but it was not the sound Motown wanted to sell to white America. It was too raw, too churchy, too honest. And Florence was not built to be quiet about it. She spoke her mind. She resisted polish. She questioned contracts. She pushed back against control. And in a system built on image and obedience, that resistance came at a cost. The success was real, but so was the distance growing between them. And soon, Florence Ballard would learn just how easily a founding voice could be replaced. Success arrived fast, and it arrived unevenly. By the mid-1960s, Florence Ballard and the Supremes were no longer just a girl group from Detroit. They were a national phenomenon. 5 #1 hits in a row, television appearances, international tours, elegant gowns, perfect choreography. To America, they looked flawless. But perfection has a cost. Behind the scenes, the balance within the group had begun to shift. Berry Gordy had a vision for Motown, one that extended far beyond black audiences. He wanted crossover. He wanted acceptance in white living rooms. And in his mind, that vision had a face and a voice. Diana Ross. Her tone was lighter, softer, more adaptable to pop radio. Berry Gordy believed she could carry Motown into a broader market. And slowly, decisions began to reflect that belief. Diana sang lead more often. Interviews centered around her. Song choices followed her range. At first, Florence accepted it. As long as the money was split evenly, she didn't object to Diana singing lead. She understood strategy. She understood business. What she struggled with was erasure. Florence believed, rightly, that she and Mary Wilson were also capable of leading songs. After all, Motown had already renamed groups before: Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas. Now it was happening again. The Supremes became Diana Ross and the Supremes. That change was more than branding. It was hierarchy. Florence felt it immediately. Contracts worsened. Touring intensified, sometimes more than 300 days a year. Earnings were substantial, but control remained firmly with Motown. Florence once recalled that the group made over $100,000 in just 10 days, money that went straight back to the label. In return, the women received a weekly allowance of $225. Power did not move with success. It stayed where it always was. Florence's resistance grew. She questioned contracts. She pushed back against creative decisions. She refused to soften herself into something she wasn't. She was not Hollywood polished. She was direct. She was emotional. She came from Brewster Projects, not finishing schools. And she did not hide it. Berry Gordy saw that as a problem. Her personal struggles deepened the conflict. The trauma she never fully healed from lingered. Depression settled in quietly. She missed her family. She feared flying. Drinking became a way to cope. As the pressure mounted, so did her absences. Missed interviews. Missed performances. Each incident was noted. Each one used as evidence. Then came the body shaming. Florence was told she was gaining weight, that she no longer fit the image. Costumes became weapons. Criticism became routine. One night, after being mocked backstage, Florence stepped on stage and deliberately pushed her stomach forward, an act of defiance that embarrassed Motown leadership. To Florence, it was the only power she felt she still had. Berry Gordy had reached his limit. Behind her back, arrangements were already in motion. A replacement had been chosen. Cindy Birdsong was recruited from Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells, quietly, strategically. Florence was not told. The public was not told. When Florence was sent home, the explanation was carefully crafted. She was exhausted. She needed rest. A temporary leave. The truth was simpler and harsher. Her time in the group was over. Florence Ballard was removed at the height of the Supreme's success. There was no farewell tour. No public acknowledgement of her role as a founding member. Her voice, the strongest of the three, according to many peers, was written out of the narrative. Patti LaBelle would later speak openly about her anger over how Cindy Birdsong was taken. The damage extended beyond Florence alone. For Florence, the fall was immediate. She returned home without the protection of the group, without the platform she had helped build. The machine moved on without her. The Supremes continued to dominate charts. Diana Ross prepared for a solo career. And Florence Ballard, once the emotional center of one of America's greatest groups, was left to face the aftermath alone. This wasn't just a personal collapse. It was a lesson in power. Talent had built the dream. Image had claimed it. And Florence Ballard paid the price for refusing to disappear quietly. The fall did not come gradually. It came all at once. When Florence Ballard was sent home from the road, she was told it was temporary. Exhaustion, they said. Health. Rest. The public explanation was gentle. The reality was final. Behind the scenes, her replacement had already taken her place on stage. Florence was no longer part of the Supremes. What followed was not freedom, it was isolation. The phone stopped ringing. Invitations disappeared. And the rules of the industry, once hidden behind success, revealed themselves fully. As part of her separation from Motown, Florence was legally restricted from promoting herself as a former member of the Supremes. She could not trade on the legacy she helped create. Her past was no longer hers to reference. She tried to fight back. Florence filed a lawsuit against Motown for unpaid royalties, seeking millions she believed she was owed after years of grueling work. The case dragged on. Power was not on her side. She lost. The settlement amounted to a fraction of what the Supremes had generated, money that barely covered debts already piled high. Worse still, the lawyer she trusted to protect her interests was later charged with embezzlement. Even the little she received was taken from her. Music, once her refuge, became harder to access. She signed a deal with ABC Records and released 2 singles. They failed to chart. Her album was shelved. The label dropped her quietly. There was no campaign, no patience. The industry had moved on. At home, life unraveled. Her marriage became violent. Stability disappeared. Florence lost her house. She moved in with her sister. Welfare became necessary. Depression deepened. Alcohol became constant. Without therapy, without institutional support, the trauma she had carried since her teenage years finally overwhelmed her. There were darker moments. Florence was robbed, kidnapped, taken advantage of by people who knew she was vulnerable. Each incident stripped away another layer of trust. Another reminder that the world she once entertained no longer felt responsible for her survival. And yet, there was still resilience. In 1975, Florence received a legal settlement that allowed her to buy a modest home and a car. For the first time in years, she felt grounded. She began reading the Bible again. She started writing about her life, hoping to tell her story in her own words. She spoke about returning to court, about reclaiming what had been taken. Most unexpectedly, she reconnected with Diana Ross. The conversation was quiet, civil. The past was not relitigated, but it was acknowledged. Florence congratulated Diana on Lady Sings the Blues. For a moment, it felt like closure was possible. Then, just as stability returned, time ran out. On February 21st, 1976, Florence Ballard died at Mount Carmel Mercy Hospital. She was 32 years old. The official cause was cardiac arrest caused by coronary thrombosis, a blood clot in one of her coronary arteries. Toxicology reports found no drugs in her system beyond a small amount of prescribed medication. Still, questions lingered. Her family would later say Florence feared for her life. Whether those fears were justified or not, one truth remains unchallenged. Florence Ballard died too young, and she died after giving everything she had to a dream that did not protect her. What she left behind was not scandal. It was absence. And absence, when paired with injustice, echoes for generations. By the time life finally offered a moment of calm, it had already taken too much. For Florence Ballard, the final chapter was not written in spotlights or sold-out theaters. It unfolded quietly, inside a modest home, surrounded by unfinished plans and fragile hope. In early 1976, Florence was trying to rebuild. A legal settlement had allowed her to buy a house and a car. She was reading the Bible again, writing about her life, thinking about telling her story in her own words, not as a cautionary tale, but as a human one. She had even reconnected with Diana Ross, letting old anger rest long enough for a civil conversation. It wasn't forgiveness. It was peace, or something close to it. Then, on February 21st, 1976, Florence Ballard died at Mount Carmel Mercy Hospital in Detroit. She was 32 years old. The official cause was cardiac arrest caused by coronary thrombosis, a blood clot in one of her coronary arteries. Despite years of rumors, toxicology reports found no alcohol or illegal drugs in her system. Her body carried the weight of heart disease, hypertension, and exhaustion, the kind that builds quietly over years of stress, trauma, and neglect. At her funeral, the music community showed up. Stevie Wonder, the Four Tops, friends, family, thousands of fans. Reverend C.L. Franklin, Aretha Franklin's father, led the service. When Diana Ross arrived, the crowd reacted with anger, grief spilling into blame. Berry Gordy did not attend. He sent flowers. The card read simply, "Goodbye, Flo." It was a moment that captured everything about Florence Ballard's life. Loved, needed, and still, somehow, left behind. Today, Florence is often remembered as the one who was replaced. But that framing misses the truth. She was not a footnote. She was a foundation. The raw, church-trained power that gave the Supremes their early depth. The voice that didn't soften easily. The artist who struggled because she would not disappear quietly inside a system built on control and image. Her story forces an uncomfortable question, one that still matters. How many voices were lost because they didn't fit the machine? If Florence Ballard had lived in a time that understood trauma, protected artists, and valued truth as much as polish, her ending might have been different. But even within her short life, she helped change American music. That cannot be taken away. So if you remember the Supremes, remember her too. Not as a tragedy, but as a voice that mattered. And if this story made you pause, reflect, or feel something you hadn't before, share your thoughts. Sometimes, telling the truth about the past is how we finally honor it.